Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple of my worm bins. So yeah, all these trays that you see out here, these all have worms living in them. And the ones we're checking in on have European nightcrawler type worms living in them. I've got a variety of different types of worms, but these two bins right here in the corner are the European nightcrawler systems that we did an interesting little test in not too long ago. We composted a couple cotton t-shirts. The worms pretty much ate all of it up, except for a little bit of synthetic fiber that was in there, some threads used to stitch the garments together, but for the most part it was cotton, and for the most part it was all eaten. So we're going to be checking in on them. Nothing fancy, no crazy tests or anything, just a typical feeding. Past few feedings have been pretty good in size, and I think the feeding that we're going to be giving them today is pretty generous too. So I'm going to slip on a glove and get these systems up on the bench, and we're going to get started. So let's get over there. During that last check-in 12 days ago, the top covering newspaper that we laid out, as well as the feeding zone indicators, were all going back into the worm bins used, so neither the top covering newspaper nor the feeding zone indicators were put in here new. Kind of making me wonder whether or not we'd be needing to replace them the next time we got in here. And after 12 days, it certainly looks to me like the top covering newspapers are pretty far gone, so we could certainly replace them today. And I've even got some coffee filters that we can include as replacement feeding zone indicators, because I usually put the feeding zone indicator, well, right where I fed to indicate where I fed, and those feedings are typically down the middle, and I see no sign of anything resembling a coffee filter out here in the middle. I mean, these newspaper bits out here on the top are pretty clearly visible as what they are and where they are. But I would say that perhaps that little chunk of paper right there, maybe this little strip over here, might be all that remains of the coffee filters that were in here as feeding zone indicators. And I mean, these little chunks of leftover newspaper top coverings are also so far gone that I think that the only real good use for them remaining anymore is just supplementary bedding down in the feeding zones. And we can always go round up a couple replacement pieces of newspaper to top cover with, should we elect to do so. I've also got a collection of coffee filters piling up that we can pick from to put down a couple replacement feeding zone indicators. So I can see signs here of strawberry. They'll usually eat up the berry itself, but the leaves from the top of the berry are remaining. And these little hollow green things with some fibers sticking out of them are what remains of some pieces of asparagus, if you ask me. That's what that right there might be as well. So it's not unusual to come back into your worm bins and find leftovers of certain foods. Other foods are very unlikely to leave leftovers. This thing right here, you could probably tell already what this is just from the loose thing hanging on the bottom and the somewhat more firm thing on top. This is the stem of a banana. Very fibrous, and if you start to kind of unwind it a little bit, you could see 3 or 4 little worms nestled within the stem. So the feeding they got last time, we're going to unearth the feeding zone to see how it's coming along. It consisted of all kinds of vegetable cuttings and leafy materials, all stuff that had been frozen, and it just looked like stuff that didn't really stand a chance of sticking around for very long in the worm bins. I do find that when I feed the worms stuff that comes out of my freezer, those foods do seem to go pretty quick, because I believe that just the freezing process and subsequent thawing process really kickstarts the breakdown process of the foods. And you can see there's a good many worms hanging out down here in the middle. I believe that what we laid down underneath the feeding last time was just some dry strips of newspaper. Not even weathered newspaper that had been like in the bin already for a while, but just stuff that was laying around here. And here's an interesting little thing. Sometimes I'll take a piece of corncob and I'll cut it into these little discs And the disc eventually becomes sort of a little donut-shaped hollow thing because the inside of the corn cob is what the worms are able to nibble out much sooner than the rest. So you're left with these little circular bits with the middle that I can't seem to get the material out of. It just keeps sticking in there. Yeah, the material in here is a little bit damp, but keeping the moisture level fairly high in your worm bins is going to produce an environment that the worms are really comfortable in and healthy in, and able to break down a lot of material for you. Not to mention the fact that if you want worms reproducing, you also need to consider the moisture content of the material that they're living in. If it's nice and damp, they'll have a greater tendency to multiply too. It's one thing I definitely enjoy doing in these two bins here is just seeing the great number of worms that you always see throughout the material everywhere. And I think over here in bin number 2 we've already excavated a pretty decent sized hole into which we can position today's feeding. Today's feeding has stuff that is pretty easily recognizable. Potato peels. Here's just a chunk of jalapeno pepper. I believe some of this over here is cauliflower. This might all just be leftovers of cauliflower. Some stems, some leaves. So that's what they're getting today. I've also got my worm chow over here on the ready. And the other thing I've got over here on the side is my pulverized eggshell, which is the material that I use as the grit to go hand in hand with some of the feedings when I'm tending to my worm bins. So if I don't forget, we'll apply a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Sometimes I just put in the stuff I bring down from the freezer, and then I cover it all up, and then I realize only later that I forgot a number of things. So hopefully we don't end up that way today. Perhaps just by saying it out loud, it'll serve as a reminder so I don't goof up. So now I've got all these things that we pulled off the top in the beginning. I think that those would really work well as a foundation for today's feeding. So why don't we just start off by returning these top covering bits of newspaper right down into the feeding zones. And then I've also got a couple of pieces of newspaper and coffee filter from a couple other systems that I removed the other day and just been sitting around. So I'm going to use those as bedding here too. I'll be right back, one moment. These things are coming in here dry, and you know, even though these are kind of torn up, we could just use these as our feeding zone indicators when we're done. So why don't we set those aside for the end, and then these can just go in as supplementary bedding beneath the foods that we're going to give them today. And then we can proceed with giving them a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So let's start with the potato peels. I'll tell you, freezing the potato peels is one thing that I need to remind myself to always do, because anytime I come into my worm bins with potato peel that's not first been frozen, first of all, the stuff takes forever to break down, but then not only that, little bits of it keep trying to grow. And even though I've seen it over and over, I do tend to forget sometimes. Then I go ahead and do it again, and then end up thinking to myself, you know, it would have been a good idea to freeze this stuff instead of putting it in raw. But that's okay. One way or another, everything eventually gets to the point where it starts decomposing in the worm bin and becomes stuff that the worms can feast on. So it's not a big deal, but it is kind of nice when the worms are able to burn through the foods that you give them rather than having the stuff just sit in the worm bin and linger and seem to take short of forever to get consumed. So yeah, my pulverized eggshell looks kind of like this. I run it through the little mini blender, and just to make sure I've got all material that's the smallest possible particle size that it could be, I pass it through a kitchen strainer. And then anything that doesn't go through the kitchen strainer, I set aside. It gets put through the blender again and again until everything is broken down to the size that I'm looking for. Alright, I like the way things look here. Doesn't seem to me like we're quite as generous as we were during the last feeding, or perhaps during the past few feedings. But it's still a nice feeding. I think they'll appreciate this. Got some leftover bits of food here and there. A little piece of banana stem, a little piece of asparagus, whatever the case may be. Try to return some of these odds and ends that we encountered along the way back into the feeding zone, but you know, that's fine. I don't think we have to go too crazy. I'm going to use the covering up of the feeding zone as an excuse to kind of go a little further outboard and examine how things look out on the far edges of each system. Out here it seems like the material's not quite as damp as it was down near where the feeding zone had been applied. There's a little chunk of old corn cob. I've kind of been getting in the habit of wanting to break this stuff up, whereas in the past I'd always just left it to kind of observe gradually how slow, yeah, slow, very slow, how long it takes for it to break down. But yeah, there's really not that much to see in that, and I've seen it plenty of times before, so I've kind of transitioned to thinking perhaps it's better to help this stuff along rather than just allow it to take forever. So a little bit of stuff from the outer edges over here too. Yeah, sometimes the corn cob goes in large, sometimes I hack it up into small pieces. Kind of depends. I'm always trying different things out. Sometimes stuff gets frozen, sometimes it doesn't. I do like to experiment and try different things and see how certain approaches work compared to other approaches. So I'm just sort of taking this as an opportunity to aerate the material as we're examining it out here and bringing it inboard to try to get the stuff kind of stirred around. Here's another one of those corn cob discs. So let's finish covering up. We'll do so with some material from this edge closer to me now. Perhaps over here too we'll bump into some older leftover bits of this and that we can check out, but it does feel like we're getting pretty close to the finish line here. Good number of worms hanging out over here too in this material. Pretty much everywhere we've looked, we've bumped into a good many worms, which is kind of nice. You know, you put the food in the middle all the time into a specific feeding zone that you use over and over and over again. Sometimes it makes you wonder if the worms are just all hanging out there all the time, or are they exploring the entire contents of the system. So it is kind of nice to look around and find worms pretty much everywhere in the bin. So here and there I'm just bumping into larger chunks of material. Most of them are just other pieces of corn cob that are so far along that crumbling them up is quite easy, so I'm just doing that. Except with those discs. I figured the discs look kind of cool and they're not very big anyway. They'll break down eventually, so I figured I'd leave those intact, but most of the other things I'm kind of helping along here too, just kind of helping this banana stem a little bit by sort of dislodging some of the fibers from one another and cracking it apart. To me, it just seems like if there's a piece of material in the worm bin, you know, food that's still holding together, then there is certain parts of it, basically the inside of it, that's not exposed prior to it being cracked, which is not getting any action, you know. So it does seem to me like a good idea to help things along if I can by breaking them. Sometimes I'm more in the mood to allow things to break down at their own pace. Sometimes I'm doing little tests with material just to not help them along and see how they progress on their own in the bins. So I'm always doing different things. But in systems like these, 215 days old, now getting feeding number 20, they are getting amongst my older bins. Not the oldest of my bins, but getting there. I've got a few bins that are older than these, but you know, not many. So these will probably be getting geared up for harvest one of these days soon, but not quite yet. I think we're still in a position to keep piling in kitchen scraps and using these wormies to break down our household waste. And then we'll start altering their check-ins to be geared a little bit more for harvest versus just everyday composting. Yeah, pretty damp in these systems. You can see a good many castings adhering to my gloves. Perhaps we can use these coffee filters / feeding zone indicators as a little bit of a tidying up opportunity before we simply drop them in. Yeah, that's pretty good. Try to return the stuff to the worm bins rather than taking it over to the sink and sending it down the drain. It seems like the better way to play it. And do we bother with top coverings? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It does seem like the worms like it though. They come up for the recirculating moisture beneath the plastic, and then there you have some nice paper for them to nibble on. But you know what? I think we're okay without it. We're just going to go one round without it. Perhaps next time we'll treat them to some replacement top coverings. For now, those feeding zone indicators will just have to do. Not to mention the fact that they got a good bit of newspaper included with their feeding, both seasoned newspaper that was out on the top as top covering, as well as just some dry that went in here. So they got other, you know, carbon-based stuff that they can nibble on. So I got a couple things to take care of, getting cleaned up, put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.